Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of the Moral Revolution podcast. As usual, I'm joined by my co host, Tony.
Hey, Laura, how are you?
Hey there, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm good. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Happy St. Patrick's Day. I'm wearing green if you can see it. Yeah.
We will post a video on YouTube. That's one of the new things we're doing now. We have posted the last episode, episode 13, on AI with our guest, Aniket Shah. It's all on YouTube for those who prefer to watch us instead of listening to us. So
I have no
that's
idea
exciting.
why
I'll do
you
the
would want
same.
to do that, but okay.
Me neither. I don't know. But okay, for those who prefer that, why not? That's another way to broadcast our episodes. So all right, yeah. So St. Patrick's Day today. It's the Irish national holiday. So Tony, that's your national holiday. So it's exciting. And today we're going to have another sort of historical episode, and we will focus on a topic that I think is very interesting, which is neoliberalism. We're going to break it down for you, talk about the origin, where it comes from, and then how it sort of affected the way that we think about our economy and a lot of the, I think, political shifts that we've observed over the last few decades. So I'm super excited about this. And Tony, why don't you take it away and get us started?
Okay, thank you, Laura. So let's talk neoliberalism. I'll start by saying that this is a controversial term. Many economists hate the term neoliberalism because they doesn't mean anything. What do you mean by neoliberalism? But I do think it conjures up a shift in mentality and ideology that took place in the 1970s, early 1980s, that gave us a very different world to the world that existed in the 3 decades after the Second World War. So my definition, let's be precise, my definition is neoliberalism is an ideology centered on the fairly free movement of capital, goods, and labor, especially capital. People forget that. Lots of
Yep.
discussion about tariffs and trade, lots of discussion about migration, but there's never any discussion about the free movement of capital, which is the central feature of the neoliberal paradigm. That goes together with liberated finance and financialization and the weakening of worker power, the paring back of social protection, and the general rollback of the role of the state in economic life. The Quinn Slobodian, the theorist, his definition of neoliberalism is basically capital's attempt to protect itself from democracy. And if you're listening to what Peter Thiel is saying about that, then you can see that there's
Yeah.
obviously something to that viewpoint. But to understand the rise of neoliberalism, let's go back to the 1970s. We need to understand 4 endings: the end of Bretton Woods, the end of the post-war growth boom, the end of social democracy, and the end of communism. All these, think of these as ingredients in the cake that became neoliberalism. So what I want to do very quickly, because, this is a lot of very detailed economic history here. So I'm just basically scanning the surface. I'm not
You're
going
so
to...
good at breaking it down, Tony. So we want to hear
Well,
your take on that.
okay, well, let's try. Let's start with the breakdown of Bretton Woods in 1971. We discussed Bretton Woods very briefly in
Yep.
an earlier episode. So just to recap, Bretton Woods was a system of fixed exchange rates where everybody was tied to the dollar and the dollar was tied to gold. Now, this wasn't the gold standard because ordinary citizens were not allowed to go and exchange their currency for gold, as under the old gold standard. The way it worked is foreign central banks could come to the US with dollars in their hand and say, give me gold for these dollars. And the US would have to say, okay, here's your gold. Recall the trilemma of international macro. You can only have 2 of 3 things: fixed exchange rates, independent monetary policy, and the free movement of capital. Now, we know under the gold standard, they basically dumped independent monetary policy. You didn't have it. But how did Bretton Woods do it? Bretton Woods squared the circle by restricting capital mobility. That was absolutely crucial. And what
Yep.
that meant is that governments were able to run monetary and fiscal policies to pursue domestic full employment. They didn't need to
Right.
worry about the external balances too much. And anyway,
Mhm.
and by the way, there was an escape hatch in Bretton Woods. Um, if the balance of payments pressures became too big, countries could devalue. So there's an important escape hatch. So, three advantages of capital controls. One, you avoid speculation and currency instability necessary for fixed exchange rates. Okay, that's one. Two, it allows for financial repression. What's that mean? That means you set low interest rates for both savers and borrowers, and that allows you to channel cheap funds to productive sectors.
Mhm.
Um, that, by the way, was the model used by Japan, Korea, and China very successfully. And it also allows governments to basically fund themselves pretty cheaply. The reduction in public debt after the Second World War in countries like the US and the UK came from financial repression. A lot of people
Yep.
forget that. It wasn't due
That's
to
right.
austerity or running big primary surpluses.
Mhm.
It was due to
Mhm.
financial repression, basically negative real interest rates. There's a third advantage of capital controls. It stops capital from threatening to leave the country over taxes or social legislation it doesn't like. And for
Uh-huh.
me, that's what made social democracy possible. Capital
Yes.
did not have the power of veto. But once you have
Yep.
free movement of capital, capital suddenly gets more powerful and has the power of veto. Keep that in
That's right.
mind. That's going to be a crucial uh, factor in the breakdown of social democracy and the rise of neoliberalism. Bretton Woods came under pressure in the late 1960s because of the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's social spending. They didn't want to pay for that with higher taxes, so the deficit rose, inflation rose. That made the dollar overvalued. Now,
Mhm.
Nixon basically said, you other countries, Germany, Japan, etc., you need to revalue your currency against us.
Mhm.
And they said, no, that'll make our exports less competitive. We're not doing that. You need to get your house in order. You need to get your own inflation down. Speculators started saying, hang on a second, the dollar's going to eventually devalue, so let's make bets against it. And so suddenly every country was going, I need to get out of dollars. But remember, under Bretton Woods, I have the right to go to Nixon and say, here's my dollars. I want gold. Give me the gold.
Yep.
Give me lots of gold. Problem. There wasn't enough gold to match all the dollar liabilities in the world. The Americans knew that. So Nixon basically said, all right, we are closing the gold window. You no longer have the right to exchange your dollars for gold. And he twinned that with a 90-day 10% temporary tariff and wage and price controls. Um, in doing that, Nixon basically ended Bretton Woods. He didn't
Yep.
realize it at the time, but 2 years later, the world will have floating exchange rates. Bretton Woods was over. Different, the European Economic Community decided that they actually liked their fixed exchange rate. So they set up a new
Yep.
system within Europe where the Deutschmark took over the leading role that the dollar once
Yep.
had. Eventually, that led to the adoption of the euro in 2000. But generally, it was a world of floating exchange rates. Now, in floating exchange rates, with no fixed exchange rate to defend, the key rationale for capital controls goes out the window. So everybody started liberalizing their capital accounts and allowing free movement of capital. In Europe, you had the Single European Act of 1986, which wanted to create a single market in goods, services, capital, and people. European countries were expected to have open capital accounts, even with countries outside Europe, by the way. As a corollary, as when capital controlled, so went finance. Countries
Yep.
started to deregulate their financial sectors aggressively. Now, we know what happens when they do that. When finance is unbottled, Lending gets directed to stuff that gives you the quickest profit,
Oh, yeah.
consumption and real estate, not productive investment, because that takes a long time
No.
to pay off. Not into that. We want quick money.
Yep.
So we're going into real estate and consumption. Problem with that is it leads to sudden stops. It leads to banking and financial crises.
Yeah.
Remember, I said the key implication is the balance of power shifted from labor to capital. Between 1980 and 2013, the average corporate tax rate in the rich countries was halved from 48% to 26%. The average top income tax rate fell from 75% to 40%. In 1990, 12 European countries had wealth taxes. That's only 3 today. That's Norway, Spain, and Switzerland. And it became so much easier for rich
Yep.
people to stash away their wealth in tax havens, which is estimated at 10% of global GDP today. An astounding number, a staggering number,
That's crazy.
all due to the liberation of capital and finance. And of course, the other implication, as I said, is financial crisis. There were, there were only 2 major banking crises between 1945 and 1970. After 1980, there were 153 banking crises. Problems started in the US when America ran tight monetary policy to
Yep.
kill inflation. That's Paul Volcker. Loose fiscal policy under Ronald Reagan with his tax cuts. That led to really high interest rates. That put huge pressure on borrowers that caused the repatriation of funds back to the US. Result, debt crisis, Latin America, communist world. Financial deregulation, banking crisis, savings and loans in the US, real estate crash in Japan that led to 2 decades of stagnation,
Yep.
asset price bubble in Sweden that led to 4% of GDP collapse. All over the world we saw this. ERM crisis in Europe after German reunification, Mexican crisis in 1994, Asian crisis in 1998, Russia, Turkey, Argentina, global financial crisis 2008, 2009, European debt crisis 2010 to 2015. It doesn't end. We are in an extremely unstable period driven by free
Yep.
movement of capital and deregulated finance, and nobody seems to join those dots. It's very frustrating. The bottom
Yep.
line is that capital is now in a position to override democracy and to get its own way. Welcome to neoliberalism, part 1.
Oh, yeah.
Now,
That's the world we live in now,
that's the
isn't
world
it?
we live in now. But there's a lot more to it than that. We also have to look at the second ending, and that's the end of the post-war growth boom.
Yeah.
Now, I like to look at total factor productivity because that's the best proxy for innovation and technological progress, the best determinant of long-term growth. In the US, between 1920 and 1970, it grew by about 2% a year.
Hmm.
After that, it fell to 0.6% a year. It rose a little bit back to 1.3% between 1994 and 2004. That's due to basically the internet
The
and
internet. Mm.
all that kind of stuff. But that petered out. It fell back to 0.7% after that. So the internet gave us a decade of growth and then it all went away. Nothing close to what we had during the post-war years. Why? Why did we lose? Why did productivity and growth fall so much from the social democratic era into the neoliberal era? I think there are 4 reasons. The most obvious reason is associated with Robert Gordon. And he basically says, well, you know what? The advances of the second industrial revolution, automobiles, electricity, stuff like that,
Mhm.
had a once and done quality.
Mm.
Once you do it once, you can't do it again. Once the
Mm.
world is electrified, you can't re-electrify it. So it's done. And he also thought that, the gains of the third industrial revolution, that's your like information technology, weren't as growth enhancing as earlier periods, which
Yep.
really led to an astounding increase in living standards.
Because it's
Um,
lighter in capital. It's just a lighter amount of
yeah,
capital
and also,
invested.
like, if you look at, you know, households being wired for plumbing and electricity and
Yeah.
sewage and all that stuff, that's a once-off thing.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, I mean, I would argue that turns out there is an interesting opportunity in that infrastructure investment cycle today with decarbonization, and that's why people
yes,
talk about a potentially a fourth industrial revolution in that context. But yes, I mean, you're right. Once you've electrified
yeah.
the country, that's a replacement. It's not like a new
Yeah.
build, so
No,
it's different.
you're
Yeah.
100% right. The creation of the electrostate is the fourth industrial revolution,
Yeah.
and we probably should do a future episode on that,
We will.
which
We
you will
will
do.
for sure. Yes.
Uh, yeah. Okay, so that's one reason. Second reason is financialization, the unbottling of finance. That does three things. First, you take the best and brightest people, and instead of putting them to use in productive areas, you put them in
Yep.
finance where they're basically glorified gamblers and traders, producing no
Mhm.
value. Second, as I said, you shift away from funding productive investments to real estate and consumer lending, not productive. Third, you shift away from broader corporate purpose to a single-minded focus on maximizing short-term shareholder value.
Yep.
So you're not investing in research and development and stuff like that. You just want quick and dirty profits today.
Yep.
All that's due to financialization. And I would argue that those three factors combined account for a large portion of the productivity decline after the 1970s. The third reason is the Thomas Piketty reason. That's the rising
Mhm.
inequality. Piketty shows there's actually a very close link between equality and productivity growth. And he argues that that's due to social democratic institutions like high quality education, universal health care, social
Yep.
protection, uh, intergenerational mobility, where the best people can rise to the top rather than just because your parents were wealthy, you become wealthy. So you could have
Yep.
like rich dumbasses who just, are rich because their parents are rich.
Eating through
So
their
with
trust
social
fund. Yep.
democracy, you can actually get the best people rising. Um,
Yep.
so that's the like inequality. And the fourth reason is declining competition and rising
Yep.
monopoly and oligopoly.
Yep.
Don't need to say much more about that, especially we know with the tech platforms today, they have
Exactly. Yeah.
great monopoly power and
It's
all
pretty
kinds.
clear what happened on that front, I
Yeah,
think, in the certainly in the American
yeah,
landscape and elsewhere,
yeah,
but definitely like very loose monopoly enforcement
yeah,
and decreased competition. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I must also point out that as well as lower growth, you also got whacked in the 1970s by high inflation.
Yeah.
Now, this was due to the two oil shocks, where oil prices rose four times in 1974 and they rose three times again in 1979. So this was a major supply shock. Now, a supply shock, if you think of simple aggregate demand and aggregate supply, a negative supply shock, you reduce your output and you increase your inflation. So you get the worst of
Mhm.
both worlds.
Worst.
Now, the problem is governments weren't used to that. They'd never seen this before. They were used
Yep.
to like tinkering with aggregate demand. We get a nice trade off between a little bit more inflation, a little bit less unemployment, tinker around the edges. Supply shocks, that didn't work anymore. You
No.
boost aggregate demand, you end up with more inflation and no more
Mhm.
growth. So they were they were stymied. They didn't know what to do. So there was a huge appetite for people to come along and say, hang on, we have a different solution. We have a new answer for you. Welcome to neoliberalism, part two. So now we
Right.
see two ingredients of the pie in together. The end of
Yep.
Bretton Woods, which created more power for capital, the end of growth, and the rising inflation, which meant that people were frustrated. This was the perfect recipe for the neoliberal turn and the end of social democracy. This began in 1979 with Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in 1980 in the US. Now, neoliberalism undermined the four key pillars of the social democratic order: the welfare state, worker power, state involvement in the economy, and Keynesian demand management.
Mhm.
Now, let's start with the welfare state. The welfare state came under strain, first because slow growth puts pressure on social promises. Uh, it encourages citizens to ask for lower taxes, and it just makes politics just more acrimonious and zero sum. So
Yep.
all of that works against the welfare state. And neoliberalism also came along and said, by the way, these generous social benefits are keeping people out of work.
Yep.
They're making life too comfortable for people who don't want to go to work. And it's making unemployment too high.
Yep.
Um, Now, one caveat there was actually no overall shrinkage in social spending over the period for a
Yeah.
very simple reason: population aging, pensions and
Yep.
healthcare are rising for all people. But the welfare state was being pared back in other areas. Secondary was worker power. Government started to blame unions and their wage demands for
Mhm.
high inflation. And business now, which had more power by the way, was itching to break free of the constraints of collective bargaining. So across the OECD, the average unionization rate fell from 42% in the late 1970s to 19% by the 2010s. So it was halved, and collective bargaining coverage also fell. In terms of the state role, neoliberalism ushered in extensive privatization.
Of course.
Um, it was justified to raise revenue. We need
The
cash,
one-off thing.
one-off
Yep.
thing. Again,
Yep.
short-term thinking.
Super
And
short-term
also to
thinking.
boost
Yeah.
productivity, because there was a feeling that, well, maybe the state sector is inefficient, is less efficient than the private sector. There was actually very little evidence for that, but
There's
people
no
bought into the
evidence for
logic.
that, but a lot of people bought
A
into
lot of
it. Yeah.
people, and fourth measure. By the way, the UK was in the lead there with Thatcher, was the
Yeah.
biggest
Yeah.
privatizer in the 80s. But who was
Yeah.
the biggest privatizer in the 90s? That was Italy.
Italy? Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
Italy.
Yeah.
Um, by the way, fourth pillar, Keynesian demand management. From now on, central banks would say we're focused on one thing:
Yep.
inflation.
Yep.
We're going to dump the goal of full employment. That in turn weakens the power of labor, because
Yep.
if you have full employment, workers have power.
Yep.
Capitalists don't want full employment. They want
No,
to keep workers on their toes.
of
So this
course.
again is another manifestation of the increasing power of capital in the decades since 1980.
I would say the Federal Reserve still has a
Yes.
twin mandate, which is actually exceptional
Yeah.
in the panorama of central banks because the Europeans went the Bundesbank route and it's only inflation control. And can I just say another thing? And we'll have an episode on sort of challenging economic orthodoxy, and maybe we'll have more than one of these. But if I look at these four pillars that you're mentioning now, right? The dismantling of the welfare state, the shift of power from worker to capital, the reduction of the role of the state in the economy, and then the reduction from demand side to supply side type economy. These are the four tenets of all the textbooks in economics
Yeah.
that I was taught as orthodoxy,
Right.
right? I
Right.
started studying economics at the end of the 90s, and this is the kind of stuff that you're taught as dogma. Like, this is
Correct.
the dogma of economic theory right here. And I must say that I bought it. I bought into a lot of
Yeah, me
this
too.
at the time, but it didn't last that long because I think that it is patently evident that this is ideology just like any other ideology. So there's a lot of stuff here that is not even
Yeah. I
proven
m-
empirically. So
I mean, there's that
anyways, just
famous
put it out
quote. I
there.
can't remember who said it. Was, when facts change, I change my mind. What do you do?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
anyways.
just to go through very quickly, so Reagan in the cut the top income tax from 70% to 38%, hammered unions, did financial
Mhm.
deregulation, kicked 1 million people off food stamps.
Mhm.
And Bush and Trump followed by cutting capital, corporate, and inheritance taxes.
And let's be honest, Clinton also followed
Oh
with
no,
the
no,
cuts
I'm
to
getting there.
welfare,
I'm getting there.
okay,
No,
okay.
no,
All
no.
right, all
Look,
right. All right, all
I'm
right.
getting to Clinton.
Okay,
He's not
okay.
escaping
He's
lightly
not
here.
he's not.
I'm getting to Clinton, yes. But before we get there, still in the 80s, Thatcher cut the top income tax from 83% to 40%, cut
Mhm.
welfare, did financial deregulation, did massive privatization,
Oh,
and
yeah.
very aggressively legislated to curb union rights.
Yeah,
More so than Reagan did, by the way, actually.
yeah.
Let's turn to France. France is a very interesting study
So
because in
interesting.
1981, you get a socialist president elected,
Yep,
Francois Mitterrand,
yep,
on a very heavy socialist platform. He comes in swinging hard. Raise the minimum wage, raise social benefits, increase top taxes, increase public employment, lower working hours, lower the retirement age, boost union power, loosen monetary policy. Woohoo, socialism! He
y
avoided the recession. That's true. But the problem was it was very hard to do this kind of reflationary policy in the
yeah,
constraints of the exchange rate mechanism of the European
right,
Union, or what
right.
wasn't the European Union then, the European Community.
Yeah,
Um, but it put pressure on the franc, which was forced to devalue 3 times, which caused a U-turn. And Mitterrand basically said, I'm going full neoliberalism. So he
yeah,
introduced austerity and became a keen. Not only did he reverse his nationalizations, he became a privatizer. So
yeah,
there you go. France, the socialist experiments in France lasted maybe 2 years, and then you had Mitterrand's U-turn. Also, neoliberalism in Italy began under the socialist Bettinocracy
yeah,
in the
yes,
1980s. Um,
yeah,
uh, he reduced. You had the scala mobile where you
yeah,
tied wages to
to
inflation. They
inflation.
got rid of that.
Yep.
Um, but it,
These are some of the first things I remember hearing on the news as a child,
yeah,
were these debates about scala mobile,
yeah,
and I literally picture, like, an escalator, and I
yeah.
was like, "What are they talking about?"
I know.
I was like a young
It's a great.
child.
It's a great term. I love it.
Yeah,
But of course, Italy, of course, had very high debt because it had. You know more this than I do. It had clientelist politics and a high
of course.
tolerance for tax evasion.
Yeah,
So debt in the 1980s rose to over 100% of GDP. And then in the
yeah,
early 1990s, you had tangentopoli and the political system collapsed in a major
yeah,
corruption scandal that brought down the
yeah.
Christian Democrats and the
Mhm.
socialists
And the
and brought
socialists, yeah.
to the rise of
Berlusconi.
Berlusconi.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
remember that.
yeah.
Yep,
And the next 2 decades were 2 decades of constant austerity and stagnation,
yep,
which
yep.
Italian politicians would say was just we had to do because of
It's
Europe.
Europe.
Um,
Yes, because of the Maastricht Treaty
Maastricht
and
Treaty.
those,
But
yeah,
you had 2 decades of no growth in living standards in Italy over
that's
that.
right.
And of course, the debt stayed at 100% of GDP because you're
That's
running
right.
to stand still.
Yeah,
Now, let me get to when did the neoliberal order become fully entrenched? In the 1990s. And
yes.
this was because it was embraced by center leftists Bill
Yep,
Clinton, Tony Blair, and Gerhard Schroeder.
100%, yeah,
All three of these, they accepted the financial deregulation. They
yeah,
accepted the curbs on worker power. And they went further on welfare reform because their goal was to push poor people from welfare to work. They
to
thought they were
work.
doing them a favor. They did
Mm,
this by shortening the duration of benefits, reducing the amount, and imposing very strict work requirements. This had the effect of pushing people into low wage, precarious, frankly shitty jobs.
yep,
And that kind of created the world that we're living in today. That was
yeah,
Clinton, that was Blair, that was Schroeder. By the way, the situation in Germany was very complicated because you had
yes,
competition from Eastern Europe and Central Europe, which
yeah,
gave German companies huge bargaining power over unions,
with
allowing them to
workers, yep,
suppress wages.
mm,
So you had
yeah,
big wage suppression in Germany. And then Schroeder came along and introduced his harsh labor market reforms, which created more low wage job categories and put work requirements on welfare recipients. So
Yeah.
all of this entrenched the neoliberal order. Even by the way, Sweden was not exempt. In 2006, a conservative government in Sweden um, did aggressive welfare cutbacks.
Yeah.
The same kind of welfare to work model pioneered by Clinton, Blair, and Schroeder. Also cut taxes and benefits and abolished wealth and property taxes. So,
Yeah.
by the eve of the global financial crisis, we are in peak neoliberalism. Peak
And
neoliberalism.
and I'll say also that some of this you see in, I know we focus on countries here, and I don't know if we'll get to the European Union later. We just talked a little bit about the Maastricht Treaty, etc. But the pillars of the current version of the European project are a free circulation of labor and free circulation of capital. And so that also put, especially with the enlargement in 2004 and the
Yeah.
welcoming of 10 new
Yes.
countries into the European
Yes.
Union that were under a former communist regime, that created a pressure on wages, a downward pressure
Yes.
on wages in the rest of Europe. And so we are living with these ideas of economic orthodoxy and the effects of those today, and their destabilizing effects on democracy, because it was a huge shock to an economic system and to the ability of people to pay their bills. So yeah.
100%. Now, you mentioned communism, so that's a great segue into
Yeah.
my fourth ending, the end of communism. Now, during the 30 golden years, communism didn't look so bad. GDP per capita in Eastern Europe grew by 3.8%, in the Soviet Union by 3.4%. But in Western Europe, it was only 4.1%. So not much different. In the US, 2.5%, a lot less. So this is why a lot of economists, like in the 1960s, Paul Samuelson was still predicting that, socialism would eventually win out over capitalism by
Mhm.
around the year 2000. So what happened? Why
Yeah.
by
What happened?
1989 was everything over? Well, the problem was, you know, central planning was actually pretty decent at producing capital goods and doing rapid industrialization. It was actually pretty lousy at producing high quality consumer goods, that the stuff that people actually wanted.
Yeah.
So
Like good cars
you had
was one
low quality
example.
crap and you
Yep.
had shortages. So,
Yeah.
the communist governments, we said, we give you a basic political package. We give you guaranteed employment, free social services, subsidized prices, and cheap housing. And in
Yep.
return, you accept a fairly low standard of living and you don't
Yep.
demand any political opening.
Yep.
That's what we are. That's what
Yep.
we give you, and that's what we ask in return. The problems began with the 1970s, with the same forces that ended social democracy in the West ended communism in the East. This is an amazing fact. Um, when oil prices spiked in the 1970s, the Soviet Union was a major oil producer. They said, well, we're not leaving all this money on the table, so we're going to make our satellites pay more for oil imports. Well, that put Eastern Europe in trouble, because remember, they weren't earning any much hard currency because they were producing only crappy goods that nobody in the West wanted to buy. So how can we
Mhm.
earn hard currency? How can we pay for this oil? So the only answer is either to cut living standards, which we don't want to do because that will create political unrest.
Mm.
Well, we could always borrow money from the West because Western banks have a shitload of money because of the oil boom, and they're more than
Mhm.
happy to lend to us. So debt rose 18 times in Hungary, 20 times in Poland, and 40 times in East Germany. Now, why the hell would Western banks lend to these countries when in retrospect it was so obvious they had no ability to repay?
Yep.
Well, they thought that, because because they're authoritarian, governments can bring down the hammer and impose harsh austerity and, get our money and pay us back. And also they said, well, ultimately, these countries are backstopped by the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is not going
That's
to let
right.
them go bankrupt. So we keep
Yep.
on lending.
I think that was a big part of it.
It
Yeah.
was a big part of it. But the problem is, with the debt crisis in the early 80s, everything went to hell.
Yeah.
Um, so there were only two choices: harsh austerity or more Western loans. Um, then in 1985, Gorbachev became general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party and basically said, I am ruling out military intervention in Eastern Europe. And by the way, I'm ruling out financial intervention too, because we have our own problems. So you're kind of on your own. Um, so the communist governments had their backs against the wall. The only option was to impose austerity. But every time they tried to do this, as Poland saw in 76 and 80, there was a lot of political unrest.
Yeah.
So they realized that they needed citizen buy-in if you wanted to do this austerity. Here's the trade-off. We will give you some political opening if you will support what we need to stabilize the economy. That was the trade-off. By 1989, this blew up on their faces and the whole system just collapsed. Um, in a very peaceful way, except for Romania, where Ceausescu was killed. Everybody else just kind of wilted away very peacefully. Now, this owed a lot to Gorbachev because Gorbachev he started off as a Leninist, by the way, and ended up as a social democrat dreaming of a common European home. He was actually a humanitarian figure who was repulsed by the thought of violence and horrified by nuclear weapons. But he was a failure at his glasnost, his political opening. All that did was lead to a resurgence of ethnic nationalism all across the
Mm,
Soviet Union.
mm,
While his perestroika, his restructuring, in a sense, it was too timid. It was the worst of both worlds. It liberalized just enough to cause trouble, but not enough to improve things in the long run. So Gorbachev always knew that if he raised prices, as happened in Eastern Europe, there would be political problems. He didn't want to do that, so he shied away from doing that. Um, he also pushed decentralization on state-owned enterprises without a proper legal framework for how these
yeah.
things operate. So the whole thing kind of collapsed from under him, and it all led to a huge hole in the Soviet budget, which meant that Gorbachev was reliant on the goodwill of the West. So he agreed with Reagan to reduce the nuclear stockpile. He pulled out of Afghanistan, and he let the satellites go, including agreeing on very lenient terms to German reunification. By this stage, by the way, the Soviet Union was disintegrating from within under the forces of nationalism. Gorbachev wanted a federal structure. He wanted a union treaty, but the other countries, the other nations weren't that interested. Um, so um, as soon as Russia came under the control of Boris Yeltsin, Gorbachev's days were numbered, and the Soviet Union in 1991 was written out of existence. Incredible, just like that.
Mm, yeah.
Now, as you the transition to communism to a market economy was turbulent everywhere. Um, GDP fell by 12% in the Czech Republic, 14% in Poland, 18% in Hungary, 24% in Slovakia, 30% in East Germany, 33% in Bulgaria, 38% in the Baltic states, and 40% in Russia. Russia also experienced hyperinflation and poverty rose to close to 80%. Now, I
Wow.
think in a future episode, we need to look at China because
Yeah.
in 1978, China took a different path and didn't have this shock therapy, didn't have this enormous economic rupture, um, and didn't have the same kind of political trajectory that Russia had. No, we can debate whether Putin is better than Xi Jinping. That's a debate worth having. But, it's very interesting to compare the different trajectories.
We should do an episode on that, and you'll lead on that, Tony, because you've read some interesting stuff recently,
It,
on
it's
that.
it's it's fascinating. So, what did these countries get? Well, let's look into it. East Germany got huge financial aid from West Germany, 5% of GDP a year. That's enormous. Poland got a $1 billion stabilization fund and a 50% write down of its debt. Very generous.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
other countries of Central European Union, as you mentioned earlier, in 2004, they got accession to the European Union,
Yep.
which gave them investment funding on the scale of the Marshall Plan. Very
Yep.
significant.
Yep.
Explains a lot of their growth in the last 2 decades. What did Russia get? Russia got nothing. Now, it was
Yeah.
estimated by the IMF that Russia needed, say, $5 billion a year to stabilize it in its transition to a market economy. That, by the way, is only about half the Marshall Plan if you compare it as a percent of GDP. But George Bush said no, not a damn penny. Why did he do this? Well, one reason is the US was in recession in 1991. So, Bush thought that it would be politically impossible to give money to Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Another issue was it was always uncertain who was actually in control. Was it Yeltsin? Was it Gorbachev? Who's running the show? We don't know. It's confusing. But the third reason, the main reason, is they said, we won the Cold War. We are not going to help our defeated foe. We won, you lost, deal with it. That, by the way, must
Yeah.
rank as one of the biggest geopolitical
Yeah.
blunders in world
Yeah.
history, because
Yeah,
look at what
seriously.
happened to Russia after that. It
Yeah.
fell into
Yeah.
the hands of a corrupt bunch of oligarchs
Yeah.
and an aggressive nationalist,
Yeah.
Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. It's
My
pretty
view,
normal reaction.
yeah,
It is similar
my
to
view
the
is that
German
that
reaction.
came out of Russia's wrenching economic experience in the first
Yep.
half of the 90s.
Yep.
Um, that could have been avoided. It
Yep.
could have easily been avoided had we been a little more far-seeing and less short-sighted.
More
More
strategic.
strategic.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't even take generosity. It's just about
Yeah,
being smart, and that
exactly.
was not smart at all.
Now, let's bring it all together. So, one, the end of Bretton Woods boosted the power of capital. Two, the economic crisis of the 1970s meant that electorates were willing to endorse the power of capital and say we go along with neoliberalism because we're out of ideas. Third, the end of communism, destroyed by the same forces that destroyed social democracy, meant that neoliberalism no longer had an ideological competitor. That's a
That's right.
crucial point. It's
Yeah.
no accident that the former communist countries went neoliberalism, not social democracy. This
Mm.
Gorbachev wanted the common European home of social democracies. He was written off. He was ignored. They went
Yep.
fully neoliberalism because there was no longer an ideological competitor.
That's right.
That is the story of the rise of neoliberalism since the 1970s and the various factors that bring it. The final thing I want to talk about in this episode is the crisis brought about by neoliberalism. Now, there's two aspects to this. One is the global financial crisis, but I'm going to shelf that for now. We'll do that in a future episode. That's a whole topic on its own.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Um, but there was also a profound social crisis all across the world, but especially in the US. Let's look at the rise in inequality since 1980 and at the share of income owned by the top 1%.
Yeah.
In the US, it went from 10% to 21%, more than doubled. In the UK, it doubled from 7% to 14%. In Italy, it doubled from 6% to 12.5%.
Wow.
I'm amazed that Italy's inequality was so low in the
Yeah, that's
1970s,
really
by the way.
interesting.
Top
Yeah,
1%
really
only
interesting.
had 6% of income. Uh, in continental Europe, it rose by a lot less, but it still rose. And that was matched, by the way, by a declining share in the top 50%. In the US, the bottom 50%. The bottom 50% in the US went from 20% in 1980 to 13% today,
My goodness.
much shallower in Europe. Between 1980 and 2017, the income share of the bottom 50% rose by 40% in Europe, but by only 3% in the United States. You
Wow.
have
Wow.
complete stagnation. Um, by the way, if you look at a study from 2017 shows that even though income per capita is quite a bit higher in the US than in Western Europe, that's not true for the bottom 50%. The bottom 50% Europeans are richer.
Hmm.
That's often neglected, often forgotten.
Yeah.
Um, and in the US, whereas in 1940, 90% of children would earn more than their parents. By 1980, that was only 50%. So the American dream faded away in the neoliberal era. Um, then you have the Great Gatsby curve, which shows the association between income inequality and intergenerational mobility, which shows that inequality is propagated
Yeah.
across
Generationally.
across
Yeah.
generations. So
Yeah.
all of these factors point to a social crisis, and the American poor have high financial distress. The bottom
Yeah.
40% basically have no wealth.
Yeah.
Um, about a quarter lacked the assets needed to replace 3 months of income.
Yeah.
About a third wouldn't be able to pay for a $400 emergency.
Yeah.
About 40% carry medical debt, and medical
Yeah.
debt accounts for two-thirds of all bankruptcies. I
My
mean,
goodness.
this is a profound social crisis in the US. Um, now, by the way, it's not so much the difference in redistribution between Europe and the US. It's more pre-distribution. It's the fact that Europe does a better job in boosting the wages of working class people than the US. So let's look into that. Let's look at
Yeah.
American wages. If you look at real median wages between 1980 and 2014, they were flat. They didn't change at all. Of course, we know what happened after 2014.
Yep.
It's all economics. As James
Yep.
Carville said, it's the economy, stupid.
Yep.
Um, Here's the most stunning fact of all. Between 1973 and 2017, real wages for prime age men without a college degree fell by 18%. Let me say that again.
That's yeah.
Real wages of men between 25 and 54 years of age without a college degree, working class men, their real wage fell by 18% at a time when real wages for people with college degrees and higher rose substantially.
Yeah.
A profound social crisis. We also see this in the gap between productivity and compensation. In the 30 golden years,
Yep.
they matched each other pretty closely.
Yep.
Um, but after 1980, productivity grew by 70%, but real hourly compensation only grew by 12%.
Yep.
So
That's quite a staggering there's a staggering chart that
there's a
shows
staggering
this, and
chart that
it's
shows that that's the
yep.
Economic Policy Institute. So what's that
Yep.
saying? That's saying is that the economy got more productive, not as productive as during the 30 golden years, by the way, but still fairly productive. But who's gaining? Well, it's
On
capital. It's not labor.
and
It's
it's
capital
exactly.
gaining, and
It's
the
the
it's
wealth,
the wealth. It's the wealthy.
owned by the top,
Yeah,
10% or
yeah.
however you slice it that gets,
And and we
that
also
increases in value.
see this in the labor share of national income, which fell from
Mhm.
65% in 1970 to 57% in recent years. So, capital gains, labor loses. Now, why?
Yeah.
What the hell is going on? Well, there are a number of explanations. One is technology. So, if you look at automation replaces low education workers on assembly lines. So there's less labor demand for them. If there's less labor demand, you get lower wages and lower employment. And that's what we see. So
Yeah.
technology, that could be a big part of it. There's also globalization, the China shock, out,
Yeah.
outsourcing and import competition from China also reduced labor demand for working class Americans,
Yeah.
um, um, who lost out big time. Um, the third explanation is lower worker power,
Yeah.
declining unions, the abandonment of the goal of full employment,
Yeah.
welfare reforms, the focus on shareholder value, local monopoly power of companies able to bid down wages, the
Yeah.
erosion of minimum wages, the fissuring of the economy, the role of gig work and
Oh,
independent
yeah.
contractors, the role
Yeah.
of non-competes and corporate-friendly arbitration, and
Yeah.
simple wage theft. All of this rose since 1980 because the institutions became much less friendly to labor and much
That's right.
more friendly to capital. Now, in my view, and I think this is borne out by the empirical evidence, worker power, labor power decline explains most of the problems. And the reason is simple is that all countries dealt with technology, all countries dealt with globalization and the China shock, but all countries didn't have the devastating social impact on the working class that Americans had. Um, so I think a lot of it is the fact that workers were screwed over by
Yeah.
institutions which worked against them in the neoliberal era. So it's the neoliberalism stupid, I would argue. Then we look at the employment side, because if you expect labor demand to fall, then, not only wages fall, but employment falls too. And that's what's happening. So manufacturing employment fell from 22% in 1975 to 8% today. Now,
Yeah.
that's mainly a story of technology. Just the
Yeah.
machines are too good. You don't need workers on the assembly lines anymore. But there was a huge drop in manufacturing employment by 34% in the decade after 2000. That
Mhm.
suggests the China shock and the global
Mhm.
financial crisis.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
problem with the China shock is, even though it wasn't that many workers, but it was very geographically concentrated that
Yeah.
caused communities to fall to ruins and hollow
Yeah.
out, and it led to a very big backlash.
Yeah.
Also, a rise in alternative work arrangements, temporary help agency workers,
Oh,
on
yeah.
call workers, contract workers, 0 hour workers, freelancers, gig workers.
Yeah.
Estimates range from between 15 to 36% of all jobs today
Yeah.
fall in this category. These people
It's a
have no
It's a shifting
protections.
of risk.
Yeah,
That's right.
they have
Yeah.
no
It's a risk shift
risk
from the
shift,
employer to the employee.
low wages, no
Yep.
benefits, no
Yep.
unions, no protections,
Yep.
constant surveillance, no
Yep.
autonomy, no dignity.
Yep.
This is where we are. I
Yep.
want to end up with another very important point, and another very important fact about working class Americans on the employment side. The ratio of employment to population, which is the best measure of employment, by the way, for prime age men in the US fell from 95% in 1968 to 86% by 2024. 14% of prime age men between 25 and 54, are not on work. That's a hidden level of
Wow.
joblessness akin to a depression.
Yeah.
We have a hidden depression. By the way, the US is second only to Italy.
Yeah.
Um, Italy has its
Just
own problems. We all
yeah.
know, with labor markets, which we can go into in another episode.
Other
Um,
episode, and also the north-south divide,
yeah,
that's still
yeah,
very,
yeah,
very important to that.
exactly.
Yeah. But yeah,
Now,
that's
who are
true.
these people? These people are men without a college degree. They're unmarried. They don't have children living with them in the same household, and they're more likely to be African American. That's the who. What about the why? Well, some blame the usual suspects: technology, globalization. But the problem is, all
Yeah.
countries deal with these factors, and all countries
Yeah.
most countries have higher employment rates for prime age men than America does. Some blame disability benefits since a lot of these men are on disability, but other countries have welfare states that are a lot more generous and they have high employment rates. Look at
Yeah.
Scandinavia, for example.
Yeah.
Some blame the high incarceration rate because it's really hard to get a job after you've been to prison.
Yeah.
And I think that
Yeah.
actually is a major factor because
Mhm.
it's one thing that makes the US unique,
Yeah.
the high levels of incarcerations. But I think the main factor is quite simple. It's the American labor market can only offer working class men poor quality, low wage, service sector jobs
Yeah.
with no protections, little autonomy, paltry benefits, and a lack
Yeah.
of dignity. Who
Yeah.
would want that deal? There's a
Yeah.
huge it's Karl Marx's alienation. There's an
Yeah.
enormous sense of alienation from the labor market,
Yeah.
um, caused by this. So you can see, so yeah. So these are and of course, the worst manifestation of this in the US is the
Uh,
so-called deaths of despair, the
yeah.
rise in deaths from suicide, drug overdoses, and alcohol poisoning among
Yeah.
working class Americans. So you have mortality rates for white working class Americans between 45 and 54 stopped falling and began to rise in the 1990s. In no
My
other
goodness.
country do we see this. This is a manifestation of the American social problem. And you put all this together, it all reached its zenith. It reached its peak around 2015. What happened in 2015? A certain character arrived on the scene who
Yeah.
claimed he had the answers, a
Yeah.
certain charlatan, a certain con man. But
Yeah.
in retrospect, it's obvious why Trumpism came on the scene.
Yeah.
It's because of neoliberalism. It's because of the economy. And it's because of all these factors that I
Yeah.
have gone through. Okay, so we did it in less than an hour, Laura. We did
Wow, look at that.
neoliberalism. So here
You
we are.
explain neoliberalism in that in less than an hour. And I'd like to say, just to add a couple of things at the tail end of that, because I do think that it's important to sort of to have these ways to interpret the current moment that we live in. I think one of the things that happened in 2015 or with the entry on the political scene of some of these characters is that the scapegoat for all the ills of working class Americans, in particular men, um, I didn't really hear many identify neoliberalism. It was really more, this is the problem because of immigrants, because of
Y-
minorities getting benefits. And so it's like it's the usual litany of just blaming the weakest, those sections of society that already have no voice. And that's the strategy, right? Just blame those who have no voice because they can't
Yeah.
complain and push
Yeah.
back.
It's funny because
And so,
the theologian Rene Girard, who, by the way,
mhm,
Peter Thiel claims to be a disciple of, which is bizarre. Rene
bizarre.
Girard, he argued that in times when societies are under stress, they have to find a scapegoat. You will
Yeah.
always find somebody to ritually murder.
Yeah.
And our scapegoats are immigrants,
Immigrants,
mainly immigrants, and the
minorities in general,
minorities.
because yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
yeah. We saw this over and over again. Like, I think, the crisis in Europe is mainly due to the financial crisis, which we'll do in another
yeah,
episode. But
yeah,
again, there in Europe with Brexit, um, the
yeah,
culprit
of
was a
course.
decade of austerity brought up
Yeah,
by David Cameron. But
yeah.
who gets the blame? Immigrants.
Immigrants. And
Uh,
it's just really interesting. And that's the other thing that I wanted to sort of to highlight was that although, I mean, you've made it really clear, your thesis, and I agree with that thesis, is that neoliberalism is really the reason why we're observing these phenomena. This comes on the tail of 40 years of economic policy going in this direction. At the same time, those blamed for this are the least responsible for it,
Hmm.
because this was very much a project that was initiated by conservative right-wing parties. It was the Republicans in the US, certainly Reagan. I mean, Nixon killed Bretton Woods. Reagan was the big supply side guy, right?
Hmm.
And the as you showed, the weakening of unions was a big part of that project, the weakening of the welfare system. Thatcher was his a partner in the UK, right? Like this very, very strong alliance between those two, and that sort of the philosophical trend. Now, it's true that left-wing parties, as you highlighted, Clinton in the US, Tony Blair in the UK, and even in other parts of Europe, left-wing parties. Schroeder is
Sure,
an
there.
example.
Yeah.
He was a social democrat, and Prodi, for example,
Prodi.
continued those
Yeah.
policies even as a Democrat. And so
Renzi. Yeah.
Renzi, etc. So this is sort of like a through line that you see, but at the same time, it's more the left-wing parties that get blamed, and the right-wing parties somehow have found a way to kind of resurrect like a phoenix, and use this anger to pursue to double down exactly on the same policies. Because what I think is interesting of the sort of Trump coalition is that it is a coalition of these kinds of conservatives, like the neoliberal conservatives, with working class types of coalitions, and the Oren Cass of this world, like thinking
Mm,
about how, for
mm,
example, immigration has hurt working class Americans. But at the end of the day, yes, that coalition was necessary to win. But at the end of the day, how is this coalition governing? Completely in this neoliberal,
100%.
thread, right? Like, what did they do? The major accomplishment of the administration: lowering taxes on the richest Americans. So
100%.
it's just a continuation of all
Yeah.
that. Yes, you can argue tariffs perhaps, but there's a lot of uncertainty around how that actually plays out. And plus, turns out that bringing manufacturing jobs back to the US takes a lot more than tariffs. Like, it takes industrial policy, and this administration doesn't seem to have the patience to do industrial policy. And so that
Yeah.
isn't happening. And so it's tariffs, and tariffs are just not that helpful. And then the other thing that's interesting is that at the same time, it's actually the administration has an alliance with the world of technology, in particular, right? The large Silicon Valley technology companies that are coming to the world with this technology that might have the potential to displace not just working class workers, as it happened with automation, but white collar workers. And so we are at a cusp where we might witness an even bigger shift.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious to see what happens. But the interesting thing is that the conservatives have not been blamed for this. This is what I find really interesting
Mm.
politically, is that the blame has fallen much, much more on the left-wing parties, actually. They've been accused of like compromising on their values and abandoning working class workers and embracing these policies, but not the ones who actually started on these policies and have really doubled, tripled down on these for the last 40 years. It's just really interesting to me politically how
Yeah.
that has happened. I think it takes a lot of ability politically
Yeah.
to write it like
Yeah.
so. I admire that in a way.
Yeah. You're 100% right. People talk about the end of neoliberalism. I say, what end? Because
Yeah,
to me, the two essential points of neoliberalism are the free movement of capital and
yeah,
deregulated finance.
yeah.
And there's been nothing to change that in recent years. Tariffs are a
No,
sideshow. Immigration restrictions are a sideshow. It's not
complete
essential to
sideshow.
neoliberalism at all. Um, and yeah, I think
But
so.
it keeps the attention and the focus on this, right?
Yeah,
It's like a high visibility type of thing, ineffective, disruptive in many ways, but not effective.
yeah,
While at the same time, the benefits of the economy continue to flow in more and more and more substantive way only to the top.
yeah,
And the proof is that the financial sector itself, right? I think that what was interesting about Trump in 2015-16 was also that he seemed to be advocating for some kind of financial reform that would break the grip of the financial sector, the donor class,
yeah.
the financial donor class on politics, and in particular friendly to all these policies of deregulation, etc. Um, but of course, that never came to
Of course
fruition.
not.
And of course, what we
Yeah,
observe today is a complete alliance of most of the financial sector banks, etc.
yeah,
It's again this like bargain, right? You
yeah,
leave us alone, and then we support you.
yeah.
And in fact, another thing that I think we talk about often, but I don't hear a lot of discussion about this on the press, is the fact that just given the types of policies that have been implemented and they're disruptive, power, like the tariffs, for example, on trade policy, but even immigration crackdowns, even the wars, etc. The pushback that I hear from capital markets is very weak. Right,
Of
the
course.
markets kept booming, etc. If it was a different type of political alliance pushing these policies, it would be a constant hammering of the message how this is bad for the economy. But it's zilch on somebody implementing these disruptive policies
Right.
from the neoliberal
Because
side, because
capital
capital
knows
wins.
at the end of the
Yeah,
day, we are gonna do
yeah,
well under these people.
exactly. So
They are
that's what
very,
they care
very
about.
fear, very it's the same bargain they made under fascism. They
Yes,
know.
it is exactly the same
Yeah,
bargain. That is a very interesting
yeah,
thing you raised, and that's exactly the same bargain. You're absolutely right. So, that's interesting. And we haven't even focused on finance today because we will do that, when we talk about the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, because it is a topic that really deserves its own, episode and
yeah.
eviscerating,
Actually, you know what? We could do that. We could do it a little bit different, and we do it together. You could do some of the more nitty-gritty finance stuff, and I could do the macro side of it.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, we could do
yeah,
that. I think that
yeah,
that would be great. Yeah, let's
yeah.
let's
We
plan
could
for
that'd
that.
be
Let's
fun.
decide.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That would be really
yeah.
fun. Okay, so I hope that our listeners enjoyed this great historical tour and hearing about neoliberalism, the definition, and also like how it came to be, and the four ends that contributed to the rise of neoliberalism. That was super interesting. Thanks for organizing that so clearly, Tony. I loved it. So thank you for that. We will close it for today. As usual, please let us know what you think. If you don't mind also leaving a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify of our podcast, if you enjoyed it, that would be fantastic. That would help us a lot. Let us know what you think. We love engaging with our listeners and our readers. So thank you so much for that. Thank you, Tony. Enjoy the rest of this St. Patrick Day.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, listeners, and we will see you all very soon. Bye bye.
Very soon. Thanks so much. Bye bye.